This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at Treefolk. I've looked at a lot of creature types in this series over the years, and Treefolk is currently the most plentiful one I've never done an MTG Top 10 on, so I thought we'd take a look at it today. Treefolk do show up on many of Magic's planes, but they have been the most prominent so far on Dominaria and Lorwyn Shadowmoor. They are one of Magic's original creature types, with Ironroot Treefolk appearing in Alpha. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the Treefolk type or be capable of making a Treefolk creature token. In all, there were 111 cards eligible for this list, and in this video, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first-tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second-tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 Treefolk in Magic. At number 10, it is Tilling Treefolk. For 2 generic and a green, this Treefolk is a 1/3 that returns 2 lands from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield. It's gained all of its points in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. In that format, it often returns cycling lands from your graveyard to your hand, like Baron Moor. It is surprisingly powerful with cycling lands, and almost feels like a Pauper version of Life from the Loam because it can generate so many cards of value. It doesn't see a ton of play in Pauper, but it isn't out of the question that it will gain more points there either. At number 9, it is Dungrove Elder. For 2 generic and a green, you get a creature with hexproof, and it has power and toughness each equal to the number of forests you control. Obviously, you want to be playing this in a mono green deck, and when you do, you get a very hard to remove creature that is likely to grow throughout the game, something that will put some fear into your opponents in many situations. While it wasn't standard, it was played in Primeval Titan decks, where it made the powerful giants enter the battlefield ability and attack trigger feel even more absurd, because it grew your Dungrove Elder every time you did it. It's also gained a few points in modern mono-green stompy decks, but it doesn't have any points anywhere since 2016. At number 8, it's Lignify. The aura costs 1 generic and a green, and it makes the enchanted creature into a 0/4 with no abilities. This card has the tribal type, which means that even though it isn't a creature, it has a creature type, and can interact with payoffs for having that particular type. It of course also makes a creature into a Treefolk, so it definitely belongs on this list despite not actually being a creature, or making a Treefolk creature token. It found a bit of success in Standard, but has gone on to significantly more success in Pauper, where it's played in Aura hexproof decks. Obviously, Lignify isn't something you want to put on your own creatures, but it's a nice removal spell that makes your ethereal armors better, and it can be tutored up by Heliod's Pilgrim, so it fits nicely into the deck. It hasn't gained any points so far in 2023 though. At number 7, it is Scurry Oak. This Treefolk costs 2 generic and a green, and it's a 1/2 with Evolve, which means if a creature enters the battlefield with greater power or toughness than it has, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And anytime the Oak gains 1 or more +1/+1 counters, it also produces a 1/1 squirrel token. In other words, this feels like it adds a nice enter the battlefield ability to many of your creatures, since you get a counter on the Oak and an extra body if that creature's big enough. It was printed in Modern Horizons 2, which means the only paper 60-card formats it's ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It's also available on Magic Arena, which means it's legal in Historic. Its points have all come in Historic and Modern, and in both formats, it's a combo piece. In Modern, it's part of a 2-card combo with Ivy Lane Denizen. When you have the 2 around, you can make as many squirrels as you want, since you can just put a counter on the Oak each time a squirrel is made, which makes another squirrel as many times as you wanted to. It takes a more convoluted combo in Historic. You need Heliod Suncrowned and Soul Warden or Trelasara along with the Oak, but when you do that, you can do the same thing, since every time a squirrel gets made, you gain a life, which lets you put a counter on the Oak. Both of these decks are more consistent than they sound because they use things like Collected Company and Eldritch Evolution to find combo pieces. The Oak is likely to gain more points in the future. At number 6, it is Treefolk Harbinger. This 0/3 costs 1 green, and when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a Treefolk or Forest and put it on top of your library. That's a pretty nice tutor, especially if your deck is highly dependent on Treefolk, and it's also nice that in a pinch, it can make sure you hit that second land drop. The Harbinger gained points in Block, Standard, and Extended, alongside one particularly powerful Treefolk, but I don't want to go too deep on that just yet because that particular Treefolk is higher up on the list. At number 5, it is Wickerbow Elder. This Treefolk costs 3 generic and a green, and it's a 4/4 that enters the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. You can pay 1 green and remove a counter to destroy an artifact or enchantment. That's a pretty nice rate overall, as you can look at it as a 5 mana 4/4 that casts Naturalize, but it has even more flexibility than that. It saw play in block, standard, and extended, where its ability to destroy Bitter Blossom was nice to have around. It's found some success in Legacy Toolbox decks, too, that use Green Sun Zenith to grab the Elder when you really need to destroy an artifact or enchantment, and there are plenty of problematic ones in that format, some of which can form devastating combos, like Painter's Servant and Grindstone, which can mill an entire library in a single activation. More recently, it's found some success in Pauper Golgari control decks, but it doesn't have any points since 2021. At number 4, it is Woodfall Primus. This Treefolk costs 5 generic and 3 green, and it gives you a 6/6 trampler that destroys a non-creature permanent when it enters the battlefield. It also has Persist, which means that when it dies, if it didn't have a -1/-1 counter, it returns to the battlefield with one. The whole package here means that you can produce up to a 4-for-1 in the right scenario, since you get a big body twice, and it can trade with something each time, and both times it enters the battlefield, it will also blow up a non-creature permanent. Notably, this includes lands, so it will virtually always have something to destroy. It never saw play in block, standard, or extended, as paying this much mana wasn't really something you could do in those formats. However, it has found success in modern and legacy decks that cheat it into play, with Through the Breach and Sneak Attack, respectively. The beauty of using one of these to put the Primus into play is not only that it smashes in for 6 right away and destroys one thing, but also that it gets sacrificed as part of the card's effect, and this means that it returns to the battlefield thanks to Persist, destroys something else, and then you hold on to this 5/5 Trampler. It doesn't get any points so far in 2023, but it's still a pretty nice thing to put into play with those two powerful cards, so it's hard to count it out entirely. At number 3, it is Doron the Siege Tower. For a white, a black, and a green, Doron is a 0/5 that makes it so that each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Even on his own, he amounts to a 3 mana 5/5, which is some pretty serious business. If you happen to search him up with the Treefolk Harbinger we saw earlier, that will be capable of swinging as a 3/3 the turn Doran comes down, and obviously enough Doron decks were loaded up with creatures with higher toughness than power. He just so happens to make cards that were heavily played in green anyway, like Tarmogoyf and Birds of Paradise, hit harder too. Doron decks were one of the better aggro decks around in both block and standard, and those decks also had a significant impact on extended and modern as well. However, it's been quite some time since the last time Doron the Siege Tower saw play in 60-card constructed formats. At number 2, it is Generous Ent, the newest card on the list by far, as it was just printed in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth, which makes it all the more impressive that it's already this high. The Lord of the Rings set is like a Modern Horizons set. In other words, the Ent is only legal in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and because it's common, Pauper, it has already found success in every one of those formats apart from Vintage. The Treefolk costs 5 generic and a green, and it's a 5/7 with reach that makes food when it enters the battlefield. However, the thing that has led to the Ent already seeing so much play is the fact that it has forest cycling for a single colorless mana. This means you can pay 1 and discard it to search up a forest and put it into your hand. Notably, the card just has to have the forest type, so it can even grab you dual lands. It's done the most work by far in Modern as a result of being great for 2 of the best decks in the format right now, Amulet Titan and Living End. Living End decks look to cycle away big creatures until they can cascade into Living End, at which point all creatures in play are destroyed and all those big cycling creatures in your graveyard come back to the battlefield. The Ent is pretty amazing to reanimate in the deck, especially because generally speaking, it's going to be entering the battlefield with a bunch of friends. It's a sideboard card in Amulet Titan decks too, where it can be used to search up important lands early. It can also be grabbed with Summoner's Pact when you really need a forest, in addition to providing a pretty nice body against some of the more commonly played creatures in the format, like Murktide Regent. Generous Ent is going to keep gaining points, and it has a very good chance to one day be the number 1 card on the list. For now though, that title belongs to Wrenn and 7. This Planeswalker costs 3 generic and 2 green and enters with 5 loyalty. It makes it on the list because of the -3, which generates a Treefolk token with reach that has power and toughness each equal to the number of lands you control. It's usually pretty amazing when a Planeswalker can immediately generate a body to protect itself, and this huge Treefolk with reach does a great job of making sure Wrenn and 7 sticks around, in addition to the fact that the token can just win you the game too. On top of that, Wrenn 7 has a +1 that lets you reveal the top 4 of your library, and then you put all lands you reveal that way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. There's a 0 ability that lets you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield, and an ultimate that is a -8 that returns all permanents from your graveyard to your hand, and you get an emblem that gets rid of your hand size restriction. All of Wrenn 7's points have come in Standard, where it's been top curve in mono-green aggro decks and a great value Planeswalker for Jund control decks. It's still in Standard right now, but it has slowed down significantly so far in 2023. It has some significant time left in the format since the rotation was moved to next year, but it still feels inevitable that Generous Ent will be passing Wrenn 7 in the future. So, those are the top 10 Treefolk in Magic. If you're interested in owning any of them, check out the description where you can find a direct card kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.